In Kenshi, we see what could be the equivalent of dungeons in the form of towers and ruins. In this video, I'd like to focus on expanded dungeons in Kenshi 2. Specifically, I'd like to focus on how the mechanics of these dungeons could work, what they might look like, what new difficulty levels they could bring, and what they might contain for players to discover. First, I'd like to start off by how these dungeons might appear in Kenshi 2. When imagining what dungeons look like in other games, I think it's common for us to think of massive, sprawling cave systems like we see in Elden Ring, Skyrim, and The Witcher. And while I believe these might work for Kenshi, I think Kenshi has an opportunity to employ more unique dungeon systems like underground labyrinths of secret labs, military bunker installations, and massive city sewer ruins from the First or Second Empire. A more classic dungeon system, like those found in the Diablo series, could involve crypts and catacombs where highly difficult enemies lurk under ancient ritual and burial sites. Another consideration when designing these dungeons would be whether or not to employ a procedurally generated dungeon system or have handcrafted dungeons that are the same each time you play. I think in a game like Kenshi, handcrafted dungeons make the most sense since most of the game world is handcrafted, and some would make an argument for procedural dungeons considering they would add even more replay value to what's already available in Kenshi. A mixture of these two methods might work best, considering some dungeons would be more important to the game's lore than others. Next up, we're going to talk about adding even more difficulty to Kenshi. If you're familiar with Kenshi, you know that there's ways to cheese bosses and use hyper-specific combat tactics to make certain enemies much easier to defeat. And yes, I'm talking about all of us who are crossbow spammers. You know who you are. And while these tactics are often necessary to defeat bosses in Kenshi because Kenshi already is a very difficult game, I think adding smaller cramped spaces underground such as cave systems and sprawling basement laboratories that span out in a labyrinthian fashion under massive secret labs would make it much more difficult to spam enemies with ranged weapons and force players to go toe-to-toe with some of the more difficult creatures and bosses in the game. I think you could even consider this to be an ultra-hard mode for Kenshi 2. I think mechanically, this might be something that's either very difficult for the developers to employ or perhaps pretty easy depending on what the game engine tools allow them to do. If we consider the interior of buildings to be a smaller version of what a dungeon could be, then it might seem quite easy for the developers to employ a massive dungeon system based on the interior mechanics of buildings and structures. We can also consider that we have built-in tools to the current interface to raise and lower the level of what we're focused on within structures and buildings, such as floor 1, 2, and 3, so we could see dungeons utilizing these tools like the up and down arrow for levels in much the same fashion. This would minimize any changes needed to the game's main interface and features. Ultimately, I think this comes down to maintaining the true spirit of a Kenshi game and not drastically changing it and making it feel like a different game, and therefore losing the charm the original game has. Lastly, I want to talk about what players could potentially find in dungeons and underground labs. Typically, in other games, we can expect to find treasure and valuables that we can sell, especially after defeating mainline bosses and world bosses. And in Kenshi, I feel like weapons and armor could be part of this treasure, just like we see in the rusted armories and decaying outposts. Potentially even more interesting would be sacred texts that contain more lore information about the fall of the First Empire, such as who was behind it and how did it happen, and perhaps even special characters you can recruit deep down in the crypts and dungeons of Kenshi 2. Tell me what you think about dungeons in Kenshi. Do you think they would enhance the overall gameplay, or do you think it would detract from what makes games like Kenshi special? What would you make if you were adding your own dungeons in Kenshi 2? Let me know your ideas in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Most of all, thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourself and look after each other. I will see you in the next video.